You're still on mute, Suzanne.
Go.
There you are.
Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. My name is Suzanne Garcia. I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I am a legal and child welfare specialist. I am dialing in today from the Aboriginal homelands of the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California. And it is my pleasure to have the honor to come to you here today from where I'm at. Terry, did you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Terry Cook. I'm a senior program associate at Children and Family Futures, where we host the National Center on Substance Abuse and Child Welfare. I'm calling in today from the ancestral lands of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina and would like to honor the land and Lumbee people, past and present. We're really thrilled you've joined us today and look forward to sharing some information with you.
Next slide. So we'd just like to get an idea of where everyone's coming from. So Marlon's going to launch a poll here. So if you'd kindly let us know whether you're court staff, substance use provider, criminal justice, medical provider. Okay, we got about half of you. Tribal victim advocate, welcome. All right, so I think we got most of us here. So we have, Marlon, you want to put up the results? So we have a whole bunch of others. Welcome. A lot of court staff, a lot of substance use providers, and a couple of people from child protection. Wonderful. Next slide, please. Okay, so today, we're going to talk about why you might want to focus your energies here. And then Terry's going to give us a brief history of substance use and addiction interventions. And then we're going to go over plans of safe care. And those are a requirement of state systems. But we're going to go over them because, that might be something you might want to link into as a healing to wellness court. But also, then we're going to talk about strategies for developing your own plans of safe care as part of your own collaborations, as part of your own healing to wellness courts to better serve Native families. And we're going to be using the 5 points of intervention to kind of frame that conversation and how you can put that work together. Next slide, please. Okay, so why concentrate on this population? Why focus on this when there's a lot of different needs? Now we have slides, we have resources at the back end of the slide deck that you all have access to. And so the details of where this data comes from is down there in those slides, but I just wanted to sum it up for you here. So the kids. So about 52% of the children who are separated from their families where substance use was identified as a condition of removal were under 1 year old. We all know about disproportionality. Native families are disproportionately represented in that number. And I think with the Native families, it's about 70% of the kids who are removed from their families where substance use is identified as a condition of removal are under the age of 1 year old. Because most of the children are born in areas where the state has jurisdiction and healthcare providers have to provide notification to state agencies when a child is born prenatally exposed, they come in contact with the state system. And the majority of those cases where substance use is at issue go straight to TPR. They have the capacity to just go straight and not even try to reunify the families. So a lot of those cases are going to TBR. In 2016, American Indian Alaska Native families had the highest rate of neonatal abstinence syndrome. And then on the other side, when we're talking about the moms, a lot of women who have given birth within the last year, we're losing them to their substance use disorders. It's a leading cause of death. Now, that data is collected state by state. We've given you a couple of slides of what some of the what's happening in the states. And again, Native families are overly represented in that number. So just in sum, this is an area where there's a lot of need. Next slide. But there's a lot of reason for hope. We do a lot of work with Dr. Mishka Turpin, and the way he kind of characterized it has always struck me. So we put his quote up here. So he said, you know, the question shouldn't be, why do women who are pregnant use substances? It should be, what do we do when a woman who struggles with substance use disorders becomes pregnant? Because normally the substance use disorder is there before she becomes pregnant. So it's not like she gets pregnant and she starts using. The medical field has made a lot of progress learning about the effects of substances during the prenatal period and how to mitigate those effects. So these are not hopeless cases. And also when women with substance use issues become pregnant, there's a lot of opportunity to engage them. And you as Healing to Wellness courts probably have that engagement with them. I wanted to draw your attention to the best practice standards from for the family treatment courts. Section 5, Part G specifically talks about treatment for pregnant women, and it's got a lot of really good information in there. And they talk about how, you know, when a woman comes into your Healing to Wellness court, she might already be pregnant. They talk about how she might become pregnant when she's with you. And if you are linked up with the state system, or if you have your own plan of safe care system within your tribe, you know, it could be that your Healing to Wellness court is the entity that's overseeing that plan of safe care. So you have a lot of contact with women who are within this population. And focusing on this population and coordinating care can really mitigate the numbers that we talked about previously, all that data. Barry, did you want to jump in and add anything to that? You're on mute now too.
I need one of those mugs. I think you did a great overview of both the urgency of the issue, but also a sense of hope that times are changing and there are interventions that we can do collectively that can make a big difference and change those grim outcomes.
Thanks, Terry. Okay, next slide.
I think
okay, well, now Terry's going to talk about substance use and addiction intervention. Thanks.
Great. On the next slide, you'll see again the approach that's been taken over time. And these next few slides are from Dr. Mishka Turpin. We'd highly recommend him as a subject matter expert who's got a lot of background in working with women with substance use disorder and really helps put it in context. And part of what he talks about is that early on, that actually the initial focus for people with substance use disorders were white women in the upper socioeconomic status, and that it was really a public health approach that was taken. Over time, that evolved, and the focus became on men, particularly non-white men, and of folks in poverty or a lower socioeconomic status. And when the who changed, so did the response, and that it really became a criminal justice response. And now we hope we're shifting back to a medical and public health approach. We're trying to universalizing language, but that tends to center, it's white-centered. And so there's room for growth to shift from that as well. On the next slide. Again, what Dr. Turplin would say is that addiction was a medical condition before it wasn't, and that we're rediscovering again that medicine and public health are important in the way that we approach this. And there's a relationship, again, as we saw in the last slide, between what we consider addiction to be and how we treat the people with a disorder. That sometimes we treat it with compassion when the people look more like us, and that predated judgment and discrimination, and hopefully that we're on the path back towards compassion and empathy and treating this as a disease as any other disease. Next slide. And this is again a visualization of what Suzanne talked about earlier, is that people don't pick up and start using drugs during their pregnancy. That virtually always it's a person who has been using substances. And in fact, Dr. Turplin would say that being unable to stop during the pregnancy is diagnostic, essentially, in saying that in fact is somebody with a substance use disorder. They want to stop, they want to do the right thing for their unborn, and they're not able to. And that we need to really think about these intersecting arrows and how we create compassionate care during this crossover time period. Next slide. One of the myths that exists out there is that there's plenty of treatment, and that if women just wanted to have treatment, that they would be able to get it. In this particular research study, you can see that with folks with opioid use disorder, as they tried to get into treatment, less than a third were able to access treatment, even when they were trying to obtain it. So again, we have a way of blaming and shaming individuals. Even when they're trying to get to supports, they're not able to always access them. Next slide. And I think we'll turn it back here to Suzanne, who's going to talk a little bit about plans of safe care.
All right, thanks. So plans of safe care. So these are requirements that the states have to do under CAPTA, which is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. They get CAPTA funds, and so they have to comply with CAPTA requirements. And one of those is to create plans of safe care when an infant has been born affected by substance uses, prenatally. And it's basically, it's family-centered case management, right? It's not just the infant's needs, it's not just mom's needs, it's supposed to be everybody's needs. Next slide, please. These are the components that are normally created in a plan of safe care. So like I said, you've got the infant and you've got the mom and you've got the family, right? So you've got the infant's medical care, both the history, their prenatal exposure history, the care they received in the hospital, other medical and developmental concerns, pediatric care and follow-up, referral to early intervention and other services, and other medical issues that they can put in there. On mom's medical care, it's their prenatal care history, their pregnancy history, other medical concerns, screening and education that she's received, follow-up care with the OBGYN, and referrals to other healthcare services. For their substance use and mental health needs, it's their substance use history, their mental health history, their treatment history, the history of medication-assisted treatment, referral to services. And then they talk, they really put in pieces about how you meet the family's other needs. What's their family history? What are their living arrangements? Do they have housing needs? Parent-child relationships. Importantly, that prior involvement with child welfare. Current services, other needed services, child safety and risk concerns. So these are the components that are normally contained within a plan of safe care. CAPTA doesn't say what has to, they don't say who oversees the plan of safe care. They don't say what has to be in the plan of safe care. The state really has a lot of latitude to develop plans of safe care that they think make sense. but these are the ones I think that you normally see in a lot of template plans of safe care. Next slide, please. So the plan of safe care, yes, it's a tool to assess family needs and identify necessary services, but it's also a process, right? So it's a way of engaging with families and really planning everything out. And it's also an approach, you know, it's a way to ensure that you have the most comprehensive, cohesive service array possible. And it's a way to really collaborate to support the families. Next slide, please. Okay, so we were wondering how in your jurisdiction or the jurisdictions that you work with, and Marlon's going to start a poll here, how are they addressing infants with prenatal substance exposure? Thank you, Alyssa. Okay, I think we're going to give about 15 seconds more for people to answer the Zoom poll, and then I'm going to ask Marlon to put the results up for us all. Okay. So it looks like from the results, there's a large focus on child safety and out-of-home placement. That's about 70%. About 25% of you are doing preventative case planning, which is fabulous. Few of you are doing targeted outreach and engagement, and no responses on criminal justice, which is great news. And now Terry's going to talk about that a little bit.
So we go to the next slide. We'll be talking, it's good that there was some interest, some folks already working on the prevention side. For those of you where the response is primarily safety and out-of-home placement, what we'll be talking about is places where folks have figured out that there's multiple approaches and that family separation doesn't have to be the answer. So the three things we'll talk about today are creating a CAPTA notification pathway as an alternative to a child abuse report when there's an infant with prenatal exposure. A number of jurisdictions are developing prenatal plans of safe care. That's not mandated by any means. It's completely voluntary, but folks are saying, why not get upstream and prevent additional exposure and hopefully, again, avoid family separation. So a lot of interesting work being done in this space. And then finally, we'll highlight a program out of the state of Washington where they're using legal advocates and a team of support right at the time of the birth event to, again, prevent entry into foster care, prevent that family separation, and provide the advocacy during a time of high stress and lots of need. So we'll get into the details for each one of these now. Next slide. So we're happy to hear that very few folks on this call are taking a criminal justice approach, but that's not true everywhere. Some states aren't choosing a prevention approach, have an emphasis on criminalization and punishment. There's one place that we know of that fellow running for sheriff puts up on a billboard the number of women prosecuted for using drugs during their pregnancy, and as kind of a selling point. It doesn't generally work, but again, we know that actually over time, the number of jurisdictions moving in kind of more of a punitive criminal justice approach has increased rather than decreased. Next slide. What we know is it doesn't work. So there's an article in JAMA from November of 2019 that said, that really looked at the 8 states listed below who had moved toward, at that point, toward a punitive approach, had kind of an infant with prenatal exposure is child abuse, and again, more of a criminal justice. What they found is it created barriers to accessing care. Who's going to go in and say, I need help during a pregnancy, if in fact that will be used against you? That erodes trust between the patients and their providers. And it actually increased the number of infants with neonatal abstinence syndrome. The women went kind of underground during the pregnancy. As they came in to deliver, those infants then had to be treated for withdrawal. So the punitive approach that was going to keep people from doing bad things absolutely failed and had the opposite effect of what folks were believing their policies would incur. Next slide. So the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a public health approach, a public health response to opioid use in pregnancy. ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, have also put out tremendous resources about how to approach this, again, from that public health support rather than a punitive and criminalizing approach. Next slide. So we'll get into some of the specifics again of what folks are doing in a creative way to avoid family separation. The first is a CAPTA notification. Next slide. And so this is some of the guidance that comes from the federal government as part of CAPTA. And Suzanne touched on a little bit of this earlier, that healthcare providers must notify Child Protective Services when there's an infant affected by substance abuse. That definition of what's an infant affected by substance abuse is also not written into federal law. That's a state decision and definition. And a lot of folks are actually looking at that and trying to make that more flexible and less punitive language there. We've underlined here, again, must notify Child Protective Services. They didn't say it's a child abuse and neglect report. And that's where people have taken that language and made some alternative pathways for folks. Congress was very clear in the information they put forward as they put out CAPTA that these notifications to child welfare on their own are not grounds to substantiate. So they don't need to be a report of child abuse and neglect, and they certainly aren't grounds to substantiate child abuse and neglect. So again, it provides latitude and flexibility for every state to make some choices of their own. There was a further guidance put out by the Children's Bureau that clarified that the development of a plan of safe care is required whether or not the circumstances constitute child maltreatment. Not everybody kind of understands that or is following that. A lot of times it's like if a call came into the hotline and the hotline says, okay, that's not abuse or neglect, we're not going to open the case, it's just shut down and a plan of safe care doesn't happen. According to the guidance from the federal government, no, that family's still entitled to services and supports. It might not be a child welfare intervention, it might not be punitive, but that family still is probably having some struggles, is in need of recovery supports. That infant may have some developmental issues that still need to be addressed, so that a plan and supports should be there for all families, whether or not it's classified as abuse or neglect. It's a lot of technicalities, but important ones. Next slide. So in the jurisdictions where we're working, this is kind of a simplified graphic to kind of help put in pictures what I've been saying. So on the left-hand side, this is what could qualify as a notification. So if you've got a parent that's already engaged in treatment, sometimes that would be a parent on MAT. So they're doing what they're supposed to, but the prescription they're given by the provider still will lead to withdrawal for the infant. But they're in recovery, they're doing the right things. That shouldn't be a report to CPS. Instead, it can be a notification. If there's no other concerns for safety, if that parent is active in other recovery supports, what some jurisdictions are doing is creating, again, a notification pathway. Sometimes it's directly to a community agency that then initiates that support plan. Sometimes it comes through child welfare, so they can double check in their computer, make sure there aren't other known kind of risk factors, and then it's diverted. But either way, what the family experiences is somebody from the community that's engaging them, coming out really from a sense of support and help, and ultimately a plan of safe care. That doesn't mean everybody will get a notification. There's still some cases where the parent's not engaged in treatment. There are concerns about abuse and neglect. They're not active in other recovery. And in those cases, it would still be an abuse and neglect report to child welfare, who would then send out an investigator, and that would either be in-home or out-of-home services with a plan of safe care. But it really creates this distinction between the two and lots more flexibility on how to support this family in need. So hopefully the graphic is helpful in creating this picture. Next slide. So people will say, so again, how do you know whether to do a notification or a child abuse report? And so in one jurisdiction, they really wanted to get specific about what behaviors would we look at to know which direction to go, to make it less subjective and more objective. And so things like, did the parent prepare for the newborn? Do they have a safe sleep plan? Were they able to access a car seat or other items that the baby needs? And again, if they're experiencing poverty, did they reach out to folks to try to get help with those? Again, did they plan for the infant? If they have a co-occurring disorder, mental health disorder, if they're getting treatment for it and things are under control, again, that's a strength and should be probably leaning towards a notification. And you can see through these, again, if they have family support, if grandma and grandpa are there, or an auntie, or a close group of friends who can support that parent in their early recovery, that's important and leans toward the notification. So again, these are some of the ways that some jurisdictions are trying to help a healthcare provider decide, I want to go down a notification pathway instead of an abuse or neglect pathway. Next slide. So prenatal plans, again, so those were, again, responding to the baby's already been born and what are we going to do? As I've mentioned earlier, that some folks are saying, why wait till then? Let's get upstream and start working during the prenatal period. So we'll take a look at some folks who've done that on the next slide. So in Oklahoma, they did start some prenatal family care. Instead of calling it a plan of safe care, which they felt was off-putting, especially during this voluntary period during prenatal care, they call it a family care plan there. It was piloted in Tulsa and Okmulgee, and in Okmulgee in particular, a very high Native American population in that jurisdiction. In this case, it was the SUD treatment providers that developed and guided the family care plan. And the results that you'll hear about in a moment were so impactful that a decision was made that, in fact, starting next week, July 1st, they'll be going statewide with all treatment providers in the state being required to offer both prenatal and postpartum family care plans. So let's take a look on the next slide about what it was that was so powerful there. So again, this was in Okmulgee, which is very rural, and Tulsa, a more urban center in Oklahoma. During the first, this was about 18 months worth of data, and they had 28 newborns during that time period between the two sites. They were able to, 27 of those 28 infants were discharged home with their mother. And what we saw for the infants was also because they'd done a lot of work to support the mom, educate her about what would happen at the hospital, have her ask for things like eat, sleep, console, that the babies themselves in Tulsa in the past had almost 100% of the time gone to the NICU for a long stay. They were treated with pharmacological intervention, and the vast majority of them went into foster care. So these outcomes with the babies going home, none of them in Tulsa ended up in NICU, and none of them had to be treated with methadone for withdrawal, were a stunning reversal of the pretty bad outcomes that had happened previously. And again, this is why they said, if we can keep families together, do it safely, and be more supportive, why wouldn't we do that statewide? And so we're in the midst of doing that. I like that some folks are pleased to hear about this. And this is the work Suzanne and I do a lot, and would be happy to talk with any of you about bringing it to your neck of the woods. So next slide. So this is the third intervention. So we had CAPTA notifications, we had prenatal plans of safe care, and then this last one is a program out of the Everett, Washington called FIRST, Family Intervention Response to Stop Trauma. So it's an interdisciplinary and cross-discipline upstream approach. It pairs a lawyer, a social worker, and a peer support specialist. And they come actually to the hospital. So mom has just given birth. The social worker is coming in saying this infant, had a positive toxicology screen and child welfare has been called. Mom's also given a pamphlet to call FIRST, who shows up, talks her through kind of what are your options. Sometimes or often that might be that she needs to enter into residential treatment. But the social workers then on the phone trying to get a treatment bed for mom and baby. And they've had a remarkable kind of effect in, again, preventing that separation. Mom and baby go together into treatment. And then that social worker also is keeping in track with them during the time they're in treatment and helping arrange for long-term supportive housing upon exit from that treatment. So again, it's a different approach. I like this one because I think also at that time of birth, any of us who've gone through that, you're already in such a vulnerable state. Now CPS is swooping in the door, and having an advocate kind of walk you through your choices before you even talk with child welfare, I think is very empowering, but also is saying kind of, in order to avoid bad outcomes, here's a path that would be different. Women are taking that path, their babies are going with them. And again, we're avoiding that separation that, as Suzanne said earlier, so many of the babies are going into care, and so many of them then there's a termination of parental rights. So if we can avoid that first removal, it's a huge, huge effect. Next slide. Back to Suzanne. Thanks for letting me share this information on some of the approaches.
Well, real quick, Terry, you mentioned eat, sleep, and console. And I had mentioned earlier that the medical field has made a lot of strides forward in mitigating the effects of prenatal substance exposure and changing its way of treatment. And eat, sleep, and console is one of those. So can you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. Dr. Grossman out of Yale helped create a different path. Again, he was a practitioner like many others that was using a tool called the Finnegan scale that looked at things like, is the baby trembling, sneezing, other kinds of concerns that would indicate that they may need to be treated with other medication to lessen the effects of withdrawal. Did a lot of research and ultimately said maybe we should be focusing more on mom as the medicine. And that's kind of his mantra now. Mom should be the medicine. If there's more skin-to-skin contact, a lot of, and the eat, sleep, console piece is that a child should not get any medication unless over a period of time they can't eat, it's like 1 ounce. They can't be consoled within 10 minutes. And they're not able to sleep for more than an hour. So there's the eat, sleep, console is still a measurement But they found that if you use mom as the medicine, if you provide her those supports, then the amount of medication the child needs is greatly reduced. And they went from something like an average of, I think it was 21 days initially, of infants in the NICU with medication to now they're in the hospital less than 5 days, and many of them not needing any medical intervention whatsoever. So it's revolutionary. And again, I just love his message about, and whether it's mom or dad or aunties, again, it's about bring the people who love this baby into the picture, and let's use medicine as the last resort.
And this is not, it's not a method that's being used in every hospital, but the hospitals that are using it are seeing incredible results, and the families, I think, are staying together more. Is that fair to say, Terry?
Yes, that's definitely one of the outcomes they're tracking, is that, again, more of these when you're involving mom, because again, part of what was happening before, the baby was in the NICU and mom was often being shamed by the nurses as she came in. You're the one that caused that for your baby, which then drove her to stay away more. So it kind of reverses that. And it took a huge culture change, but it's been replicated all over the country and is having amazing results everywhere.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so this slide represents something that I think Children and Family Futures came up with. Is that correct, Terry?
Yep.
So these are the 5 points of family intervention, right? And so the idea is for jurisdictions to create a continuum of care from pre-pregnancy all the way to childhood and adolescence, right? So pre-pregnancy, you're focusing on preventing substance use disorders. And so for the Healing to Wellness courts, you know, it would be checking in with the parents, you know, and I think, I like the way Terry put it one time, is that one way to approach it, because this can be a sensitive area, is, do you plan on becoming pregnant within the next 12 months? Yes? Okay, how can we support you? No? Okay, how can we support you? So these are just kind of, you know, ways to interact with your participants in your Healing to Wellness courts to help get that prevention piece in as early as possible. And then when they are pregnant, you know, of course, you want to identify substance use disorders through screening and engagement, engage the women in effective treatment services, and provide a lot of support, which you as Healing to Wellness courts can do. At the birth event, you know, Terry was talking about the prenatal plans of safe care. If you have a plan in place, it allows the birth to be the joyful experience that we all want it to be, instead of a time of fear and panic. You know, everybody, and I think in some parts of the country, Terry, is it correct that, you know, the hospitals already know that there's a plan in place, and they've already talked with the mom and the team, and so everybody kind of knows what to expect, and child welfare knows what to expect, right? So there's no surprises. Yeah? Okay. Infancy, postpartum. At that point, you know, unfortunately, things tend to kind of shift, and everyone's looking at the baby's healthcare, and mom can there's a tendency to kind of forget that the parents exist. So that's a time when you really want to get in there and provide her with the most support possible. Childhood and adolescence, unfortunately, I think a lot of kids, or some kids who are prenatally exposed, aren't identified until they go to school. And that's where the behaviors start being identified. And if you wait too long to get in there and try to provide the families with support, they end up getting in trouble in school, and then they end up in the juvenile justice system, and then other systems. And so so you want to get in there and make sure that as much as possible, there's no gaps in services, and you're providing as much support as possible. So these are the 5 points of intervention, and I really like it because it really helps frame the work. Next slide, please. I spoke briefly about the year after mom gives birth, and that, you know, unfortunately, one of the leading causes of death during this fourth trimester, the year after, with women with substance use disorders is the substance use disorder. That's one of the leading causes of death now. And from the best practices standards that I've been reviewing, they talk that women with substance use disorders are more likely to have postpartum depression than those that don't. So this is a really critical period. But it's also a really neglected period. You know, the care shifts from being frequent to infrequent. Like I said, goes from mom focused to baby focused, and you know they're looking less at the medical needs of everybody and more of the social needs. And the continuity of care is often left to the provider, who might not have all the resources that you would want. And so I think this is where you, with your wellness teams, can really come in and really ensure that all of the needs are met. Carrie, did you want to add anything into that?
One piece I'd add maybe is, I think one of the other things we found is that many jurisdictions had caps on women could only get services, health services, for 60 days post-delivery. And that really complicated if many women are dying from overdose during that period after, again, as they're dealing with postpartum depression, if you're losing your insurance at that point, that's a real barrier. So to my understanding, there's recent efforts at the federal level to make it easier for states to take on, to extend that from 60 days to a full year without as many hoops as you used to have to jump through to get there. So I think it's one recognition around maternal mortality that is recent, and that if you're in a jurisdiction where they're still dropping people at 60 days, there's hope there on the horizon that can be different, and that again, that access to care is ensured for the full first year.
Thanks. Okay, next slide. So there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of opportunities here to work with women with substance use disorders who become pregnant. And, you know, with universal prenatal screening and coordinated substance use disorder treatment during the prenatal stage, birth protocols during the birth stage, and then beyond, you know, there's really an opportunity here to address those numbers that I talked about at the beginning, which are just so disheartening. Next slide, please. So we're trying to achieve healthier pregnancies, healthier babies that remain together. That's the name of the game, right? We want to keep the families together, and we want them to be strong, and we want them to be healthy. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about what the states are doing, and so now we're going to talk a little bit about what your collaborations might look like and some kind of tips for how you might want to go about building those. You've already got, you know, one of the reasons we're here today is because you as Healing to Wellness courts, you've already got so many of the pieces in place. It's just a little slight shift in practice to support this population and really to have some big impacts. Next slide, please. So 4 kind of steps that I see in building your plan of safe care, family care program is, you know, first you want to assess what's already kind of going on. You want to gather your partners, which a lot of you already have most of the partners in place. As I said, you would want to set a vision. I like work plans. I used to hate work plans. I'm now a convert. I like work plans because we're all so busy. It's nice to have a plan and say, okay, what did we say we were going to do? I have to admit to being a convert. And then consider evaluation and data. The states under CAPTA have to keep data, but it's not normally specific to tribes, right? They might keep data on what's happening with the Native American population, but it might not be tribe to tribe. And there's just an absolute dearth of data on this when it comes tribe to tribe. So that's where really the tribal healing to wellness courts, I think, can help fill in some of those gaps. Next slide, please. So if I was going to be putting one of these together, the first thing I would do, because the states are required to put together these plans of safe care, was to figure out what they're doing, right? So what does their plan of safe care process look like? Are the substance use providers, are they the ones in charge of those that don't go to child welfare? What's happening with your medical providers? Are the hospitals implementing Eat, Sleep, Consult? If not, why not? Maybe they should be. DV, sexual assault and trafficking, are there any units that are specifically providing services to Native families? That might be someone you might want to connect with in order to better serve that population who's so vulnerable. State child welfare, human services, are they doing plans of safe care? I kind of think that prenatal plans of safe care and plans of safe care, that's active efforts, right? That's, I really think they should have been doing this all along, but they should be doing it in conjunction with the tribes. And if they're not, why aren't they? Do they have a 4E prevention plan? Is there some way to tap into that? You want to check in with your Office of Public Health and see if they're taking a public health approach to substance use disorders. Head Start and education, because I said a lot of the kids aren't being identified until they're in school. Law enforcement, hopefully, your jurisdiction is not going towards the punitive criminal justice way of doing things, and the courts, because Terry and I met over a grant that was specifically provided to the courts, and there was a lot of court improvement programs and healing to wellness, state healing to wellness courts, and also attorneys who were really up on these issues and could be a really good partner. So I would first look at what the states are doing and try to fit in, would they be a good partner? Are they doing things that you think, are they not doing things that you think they should be doing? Are there some gaps that you can help fill in?
One note on that,
please.
Suzanne,
Go ahead.
with law enforcement, in one jurisdiction, they actually started unexpectedly getting referrals from law enforcement who were saying, we'd like to release this incarcerated pregnant woman, but we'd like her to go into treatment. So we'd like to release her on her own recognizance and have her come straight to you to get the support she needs to have a healthy baby. So that was an unexpected, it wasn't what they intended when they started the program, but they ended up getting quite a few referrals from that source. So even criminal justice can come up with a preventative supportive model.
Next step, I would be looking, within your tribe, what kind of programs are going on there. There's the tribal opioid response grants. There's tribal action plans. You probably, being a healing to wellness court, you probably have a lot of these things in hand already, but sometimes it's hard to put it all together because there's so many people doing so many different things. But that would be my next step, is to look at, see what the tribe is doing. I know the National American Indian Housing Council is active in this area because they've got, provisions that if there's drug use in the house, they can no longer get housing assistance, and that leads to more housing instability and so they're trying to address that problem. You want to check in with your child welfare department. I was really lucky. The tribe I worked for had a top-notch grants department, and she was my one-stop shop. If I wanted to find out what was going on in an issue, I went to her office, and she knew what everybody was doing. So that would be my second step. Second step was to go and look within the tribe and see what's going on. Next slide, please. So again, I like the 5 points of family intervention, and I wanted to put this slide up again because in looking at that, what you're trying to do is figure out where to fill in the gaps, where the gaps in the services are, and what you can do as a Healing to Wellness Court to help fill those gaps and possibly, and also provide a lot of support to these families. Carrie, did you want to add into that? Or?
I created this slide for some folks in Oklahoma because that's what they've been doing over the last year to 18 months. And they needed a visualization of it because they have so many projects that are popping up to fill the gaps that they've found. So this was an attempt to start creating a visual of here, the things that are outlined are the ones that are still in the process of implementation. So it was like, here's what exists, here's what we're building, and how do we keep adding to this until we have all the needs met for these families. So it's just one visualization of how one community is essentially trying to take each part of this and plug holes and provide supports.
Next slide, please. You guys, at Healing to Wellness Courts, you already have a team, but these are some tips that I got from Judge Thorne about, don't forget your champions, because, engaging families who are struggling with prenatal substance, with substance use who become pregnant, there's so much fear there. They're going to have a hard time engaging. So you're going to need champions who are going to work on the long term. So word gets out in the community that these are people you can come to, these are people you can trust, and they're going to help you keep your family together. That's also why you need visionaries. You need people with a long range vision. You need consensus builders. And you need people with an insight into the history of the relationships. I went on site one time and we were talking about the different birthing units at the different hospitals, and they're like, oh yeah, no one goes to that one because we all know what's going to happen if we go to that hospital. So we, most of the family in our community, they go to this other hospital because they don't treat us as badly as that hospital. So getting that kind of lay on the land can really help move your project forward. We have a question. Carol asked, are we sharing this type of information with the National and BIA drug endangered children folks? How could this interface? At this point, I have not, but that's a really good tip. So thank you, Carol. I'll write that down. Next slide, please. So this is really simplistic, but these are the typical domains in a state plan of safe care, right? The templates. They've got the medical care, they've got the counseling, the medications that the family is taking, and parental and family supports, right? So this is kind of typical. Like I said, really simple, but fairly typical. Next slide, please. What we found when the tribes put together a template is they prioritized traditional means of healing and added that into the plan of safe care template. They emphasized reconnecting families to their community. They also emphasized reconnecting families to their culture. So the plans of safe care that the tribes are creating have a whole different take on things. And so this might be why you might want to create your own standalone template plan of safe care that you then ask the state child welfare to recognize. And you might want to use for your own within your Healing to Wellness Court. Next slide, please. The Yurok tribe, in terms of, has put together this cultural connection assessment, and that's how they, so they work with the families and they meet them where they're at, and this is part of their plan of safe care process, is meeting families where they're at, finding out how they would like to connect, and then helping them make that connection. That's part of the healing process for them. Next slide. They call it their Econor Program, which means keep safe. And it's more about attaining balance. It's not about the safety of the child and the wellness. They talk about it in terms of balance. And they've made their plan of safe care template. They've interwoven their language into it, right? So it's much different than the state templates that we've seen. Next slide, please. I thought this was really cool. They make, as part of their plan of safe care process, they walk the family through what they can expect at their prenatal visit. And they hit all of these things, the information about safe sleep, guides about rooming in, resources available to the family. They talk to them about what to expect during their hospital stay, during, what they can expect out of a hospital tour. And they review preferences for the family's birth plan. So this just helps take some of the fear and anxiety out of what should be a very joyful process. Next slide. And they help them create a birth plan, so they sit down with the family, and it's, important things to know about me. Special instructions for delivery and birth, any important issues, fears, or concerns they have, and important people they would like in the room when they give birth. Carrie, did you want to add to any of this?
I think you're doing a great job. Again, it was really specialized to meet the needs of this Native population. And I really appreciated, again, that they took their language and their concepts and wove it throughout. So that, again, it felt engaging and respectful.
Right. One of the things that we found when we were doing the work out there is what the hospital didn't understand, and this was a huge point this was a huge issue between the tribal members and the hospital, because the nurses were coming in, what's the name of the baby? What's the name of the baby? And in their way, they don't name the baby immediately. That's not something they do. And the hospital didn't, the nursing staff didn't understand that. And it sounds like a little thing, but man, it cleared up all sorts of awkwardness. And, the families felt like kind of they were being antagonized by the nurses coming in constantly. So just even having that conversation with the birthing units really cleared up and made the process a whole lot better. Next slide, please. And then part of their Econor plan is the postpartum plan, really important. And again, that question, do you plan on having a baby again in the next 12 months? If yes, how can we support you? If no, how can we support you? Next slide. Infant needs was part of there, and these are just screenshots of what their plan of safe care looked like. Next slide, please. So we wanted to give you an idea of what a different family care plan could look like. Terry, did you want to walk through these next couple of slides on this?
Sure. So this again is from Oklahoma. This is the one being used during the prenatal period. So again, it's developed with the pregnant individual and other caregivers that are involved with that parent and the infant. And it serves as a tool to help navigate all of the things that Suzanne just talked about around the hospital and the rest. Part of what they wanted to do was recognize strengths again. Who are the current supports? What are the strengths and goals that parent has for themselves and for their family? On the next slide, you'll see that they also wanted to make sure that immediate needs were taken care of. If you're in front of me today, and yes, there's a substance use disorder we need to deal with, a key issue is, do you have food at home for yourself and for your other little ones? And so having an immediate needs component was super useful. And if I meet your basic needs, then we can get to the larger issues that we need to tackle together. And so again, you'll see in this on each of these is the person already receiving this? Do you need a new referral? Or it just doesn't pertain to this individual. Next slide. And again, it gets into, again, both the health for both mom and for the infant. Looking at, again, long-term, are there education and support or legal assistance needed? You'll see, again, there's a place to do some education around things like Eat, Sleep, and Console, and or things like Early Head Start. I learned that in many jurisdictions, a woman can sign up for early Head Start during her pregnancy. And if she does sign up during that time period, then the infant is automatically eligible upon birth. It's like, who knew? And now there's not a wait list on the other side. What a great idea. So again, this is again an approach, and this was a mashup of ones that prenatal care providers, the docs were doing, and the treatment providers, and it's been meshed into one. This is the one that is going statewide next week. And I think on the next slide, we actually have, and what I can say is that this is a 2-page form. What they do in Oklahoma is really put it together in the context of a binder that you'll see here on the slide that really puts together all of those resources and helps the mom be a self-advocate. So we'll take a minute to look at the binder and the approach that goes along with this. You know, a 2-page referral form isn't going to change the world. The approach that surrounds the family actually does. And SAFER is the name of the project that you saw those great outcomes from earlier. So let's go ahead and see if we can get this one going. Again, a lot of this initial information, consent forms, always making sure parents understand what's happening. This was a note saying that moms should breastfeed after giving birth, and making sure the doctor and child welfare knew that. Who else are in my support groups? Will be here if needed. If in the history of, yes, I've been in treatment. I've had two come in. If there is family planning. So as you can see from this video that, again, the plan of safe care isn't just that 2-page document that says what referrals you got. The binder that they create in Tulsa actually became the pregnant individuals loved it so much they told everybody else, and now when people come in, they say, can I get the binder? I'm pregnant, I want the binder. And you can see from it lots of information, education, a lot of self-advocacy that can happen when people are empowered. You saw a place for business cards so that everybody they've interacted with during the pregnancy, you know, you could lay it all right out. And again, women will come to the hospital with their binder so that if a referral is made to child welfare, they have kind of the proof in the pudding of here's everything I've done to prepare myself and my family for the future. And that's that approach and that wraparound of supports, and that woman truly believing there's people who want me to stay intact with my family. I have supports when and where I want them, has led to those great outcomes where 27 of the 28 babies went home with mom and are staying home with mom because the supports are continued through that first year of life. So again, I think the binder just hopefully that was helpful in giving you the visualization of it's not a simple referral. It's really about the engagement, about a team working with that parent, and the ongoing supports for the entire family. Next slide. So we've talked about the 5 points of intervention. We don't need to go through that again, but again, the work we're doing with jurisdictions is across all of these points so that it's a cohesive and predictable and consistent response that families can expect from all of the providers. Next slide. I think we have a poll here.
I don't know if it was poll or is it, you know, it's something I think I think it's something to think about. So as healing to wellness courts, you know, if the judges ask about them, you know, say one of your participants is pregnant or has just had a child, she should have a plan of safe care that the state has created. So even just the simple act of the judge asking about them and, you know, the team inquiring about them and see if the state has put them into place. But if you're creating your own plan of safe care as a healing to wellness court, you know, something to think about is what would the services and what would the supports be that you would provide across those 5 points of intervention? What is the continuum of care going to look like in your program? Next slide, please.
So Suzanne and Terry, I don't know if you were able to kind of look in the chat, but there's a couple of questions. The first one is, are you sharing this type of information with national and BIA drug endangered children folks? How could this interface?
We had not. And so, Carol, I'd love to follow up with you on that and to talk about how they could interface, because I think that's a really good idea for spreading the word on this. So okay. Thank you.
And then another question is, how are the other children, if there are some, are addressed?
What we've seen, again, you're right that oftentimes you're working with an individual while they're pregnant, but there's other small children at home. And so the treatment providers that have done this work are definitely always paying attention both to the pregnancy and to the existing children, and working with the parent and having clarity around if there is continued use and that puts the existing children in danger, we have to deal with that. We're mandated reporters, and we're going to work with you on it. We're also going to try to help you set up safety plans so that if you are going to use, you're getting the children to a safe place and that you have a plan in advance for that. So yes, the other children do need to be addressed. What we've also found is sometimes the women that are getting these prenatal plans of safe care have other children already in foster care. And previously they would hide the pregnancy, the new pregnancy. It's like, I don't want this newborn taken too. But as they get a different response during the pregnancy, that's actually helping them get into the treatment, get into recovery, and increasing the odds of having those other children then returned home after the newborn, after the new baby is born. So yes, absolutely, always balancing current children with the unborn and making a plan that's encompassing all of them.
So I think we're at the end of our presentation here, but yeah, we wanted to open it up and see if any, if there were more questions or comments that people had about this work. And I think Marlon dropped something in the chat box that, Terry and I are going to stick around after. If you'd like to come up after the presentation. My favorite part of a presentation was always having the conversations afterwards. So we're going to hang out here for a little bit after the recording stops and just chat if you would like to chat. Also, I'd like to point out at the end of our slide deck, there are a bunch of resources in addition to the data, the specific data that I talked about. Children and Family Futures put together a resource of what all the different states are doing with their plans of safe care. So that could be your first step in figuring out how and if you want to link up with what the states are doing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for our session. There will be a evaluation link dropped in the chat box, which Marlon is gonna put in there for us. We encourage you to please fill out your evaluation, and also thank you for attending today's session. Building collaborations to reduce prenatal substance exposure and keep families together. Just as a reminder, all recordings will be posted and remain on this platform until July 30th. After this, you may find recordings at enhancementtrainings.org. Thank you.